morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest in the Hydrock Present series of webinars. My name is Sarah Rawlings, and I'm a director at Specialist Built Environment PR agency, LCA, London Communications Agency. So we've all read and heard an enormous amount of debate and speculation about the future of offices and what working patterns might look like in the post-pandemic world. What we'd like to do today is take as read that the world's changed, and at least in the short to medium term, the way we use our office buildings will be different. There is going to be varying models of hybrid working, flexible working. So what our panel would like to discuss is what that actually means for building, for building performance, for sustainability, for health and well-being, and of course for efficiency and cost effectiveness. I'm delighted to welcome our panel who'll guide us through some of the key issues around the topic before answering some of your questions. We have Yasmin Alani-Spence, the Director at Architecture Practice Wilkinson Eyre, Tom Larson, Design Director at Stanhope, John Reed, Development Director at Meridian Water, and Dr. Annie Marsden, an Associate at Hydrock. We will be having questions at the end of the session. Can I ask that as we go along, you post your questions in the chat? We'll select from those. Can I ask that along with your question, you post your name and your organisation? Thanks very much. So, to kick us off, I'd like to ask Annie to set the scene. From your perspective, looking at building performance, what do you see as the primary challenges we're facing, just to ensure that the UK's stock of office buildings can be energy efficient, cost effective, and places in which people actually want to work?
Hi, Sarah. Thanks. I think it's really interesting the last year because we've obviously moved out of offices and worked from home, and I think it gives a good idea of many of the challenges our offices face. One of the things I've really noticed is that with our existing building stock, we probably don't take care of it well enough. And so I think one of the main things we can look at is how we control our buildings and how we optimise them. That will be really important moving forward as flexible workplaces come in and we start using our buildings in slightly different ways. I'm a big fan of the old controls and commissioning. Let's make our buildings work properly and work for us and make them comfortable places for us to live and work in.
Thanks, Tom. Can we just move on to you for a slightly different perspective? Obviously, you're at Stanhope, you're looking at trying to attract and retain tenants in your buildings. What's your take on this?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so at Stanhope, obviously, we don't think that this is the death of the office, first and foremost, but we do think that, there will be some dramatic technological and cultural shifts that will really affect the way that we all in the sorts of jobs that we do, relatively high paid service type jobs, will be some benefits to people's health and well-being, but that will put pressure on the office buildings and other buildings that we occupy in terms of what they offer to the customers. So in respect to building performance, and I think first and foremost we're talking about services and MEP when we talk about building performance in this aspect. I think fundamentally we need to keep continuing to improve the performance gap between what we design and what our buildings actually perform in use. Then there's key aspects to that around how we manage our buildings and how we sort of take and distribute data from our assets. So as well as on the operational side, I think clearly the embodied energy that's contained within our buildings, the way that we design new buildings to minimise embodied energy and also set them up to perform better in use is a key aspect. On a slightly broader point, moving forward, some of the research we've been doing and others have been doing suggests, we're moving to sort of a 3 or 4 day working week and a flattened peak, with no traditional 9 to 5 or Monday to Friday working patterns. So how our buildings respond to that is really important. How we manage energy consumption, how we sort of get the most out of the physical assets that we have in cities is really important. And I think, that sort of links into a slightly wider point about, building performance in the round. So fundamentally, how do our buildings, particularly office buildings, going forward, meet the needs of the customers? And that will be the true measure of a building's performance over and above, simply the MEP. So yeah, I think that's sort of the main points I wanted to cover on that. Sarah? Thanks
very much indeed, Tom. John, I just wanted to move on to you. I mean, you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective in your current role. You're looking to create workspace alongside a new community outside of that sort of traditional Zone 1 city centre location. Does this put you at an advantage with, if Tom's saying we're going to be working not 9 to 5, not Monday to Friday? What are the key drivers for you in that kind of provision of workspace?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. Well, in my previous role, I looked after delivering office space for Grosvenor in central London. So it certainly is a very different product that we're looking at now. And I think some of the things that Tom has talked about and you've just mentioned there very much play to the future that we see, which is much more of a mixed work-life kind of balance in the accommodation that we're offering at Meridian Water. And one of the things that drives us is that our spaces are very much community-led. So we're not starting necessarily from a business case that is setting out a fixed financial return. We're starting from a point where we want to develop a new community, and then we want there to be a really good, healthy mix of both uses for that community to enjoy, but also jobs creation. So it's a very different starting point in terms of brief. So for 10,000 homes, we want to create the equivalent of 6,000 jobs, and that in itself defines the amount of space and the types of spaces we have. And then if I'll just say a few things about the spaces that we've already got, and then perhaps how we see those spaces evolving. So the spaces we've got at the moment, the site is a very industrial site, which is, perhaps what you would see more in outer London areas. And as a result of that, we have more kind of warehousey style and incubator and kind of maker creator type office, if you like, space, because those businesses also need office space to design and generate ideas as well as spaces to make. And so we're providing, for example, an incubator business funded by the GLA that allows individuals to come and design and make things, could be out of wood, could be out of metal, in a large warehouse in the middle of the site, and that in itself generates a huge kind of employment use, but it also creates challenges with the type of building because it's kind of large, open, warehousey, but also needs kind of cafes and office and drawing space. So I suppose my takeaway is the types of space we're creating are very different. They're about the community, they're about supporting jobs, they're about allowing businesses to grow through the lifespan and move perhaps to different spaces within the development over the life of the business. And then I just wanted to kind of touch on some of the kind of residential work dimensions that I think we're seeing. So obviously lockdown a year old now, and I think there's a few lessons that we kind of can easily take from that, which is importance of green space, ability to be able to work from home really effectively. So some of the things that we're thinking about in that regard is how do we create this really strong mix of work and residential? And so one of the schemes that we're bringing forward is a build to rent scheme, which we think will have really high levels of office facility, which, during the day, it's all very much focused around quiet work environment, collaboration space, then in the evening turns into more of a social bar kind of interaction with your kind of colleagues and friends. So it could be your worst nightmare if you don't get on with your neighbours, or it could be an absolute dream come true that you will not have to commute and you just stay in one building via the park at lunchtime for all your residential and working needs. So but one thing is for sure, we won't be producing traditional Cat A and Cat B office space at Meridian Water.
Thanks, John. I think that's really interesting. It moves on very neatly to something I wanted to talk to Yasmin, because I think, you know, whether it's the incubator type space that in Meridian Water or the more sort of city centre office space that Tom is talking about, I think, Yasmin, I mean, we're all agreed that it's about good and better working environments. It doesn't matter whether you're in Enfield or whether you're in the city. We're talking about creating better working environments for people. I mean, you know, John touched on the working from home, and there is conversation around, you know, what is a better working environment where to get you onto the train or onto the tube and actually want to commute and go back into the office. So what does, from your point of view, what does constitute better, and what's the role of you as an architect and the wider design team in creating those better environments?
Yes, thanks. Hi, Sarah and everybody else. As John just sort of said, you know, today marks the 1-year anniversary of lockdown, so it's quite appropriate to have this today. And we've all talked about it right from the beginning a year ago, and it's quite interesting to see a year later how our own perceptions have changed from what we all thought about a year ago. And the key for me here is that we mustn't let this year be wasted and just move on and do snap decisions in how the future of the office or housing, for that matter, might look. We should really take this opportunity to reassess what we as employees, wherever we are, need in our working space and in our working lives, and how that can be facilitated. I mean, having spoken to so many people, I think the key issues, the key common denominators that we can take away from this year is for the future of the office space. It needs to be a healthy space with a better space allocation. A lot of our offices had to shut down because we didn't actually have enough space for people not to sit on top of each other, but to have space around them. If we take the 1 meter sort of rule, a space that really gets you in because of collaboration. That's, I think, what most people miss. I think we've all learned we can do very well in technology, but what we're still missing is the people that we work with, the interactions, what you learn and perceive. And so taking that further, then, you know, a lot of our clients and developers are obviously bigger companies, sorry, not so much developers, are talking about, again, as John touched on, this gaining and retaining talent. And that's always been a sort of the key ethos. But it's gone further now. And I think COVID and this last year has pushed that further. It's not just about the cool office space or all the amenities, but it's a meaningful space. What makes people leave their home? And I think the first thing that makes people still leave their home is other people, more than anything else. So I think our offices will see a bigger shift, that we can maybe use this possibility of flexible working, that we do our more focused work at home, but the office, it really becomes more about humans, about people, about collaboration. And it has to work with technology, because again, one thing we've really learned is that technology is now the underlying support for whatever we are doing with our buildings or at home. So I think the new, and we need to also not just let people come in with the healthy buildings, but provide a reason for them also, that social interaction as well. Again, we did touch on amenity spaces, that they have this reason to go, much more fulfilling than it was before, maybe going to the office and come home. Thanks,
Yasmin. Annie, just to follow that up a little bit, I mean, is the existing building stock equipped to do that? I mean, people are going in to collaborate. That assumes they're going to collaborate with some people physically in the same space, but actually, again, hybrid collaboration perhaps, and you know, liaising with people outside. I mean, how's that going to work, or is it going to work in terms of the offices we've got now?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because Tom, Yasmin and John all came up with different working patterns, different building patterns. So the internal is going to change, the way we're going to use buildings is going to change. And I think we don't know what that change is. We can make guesses, and I think we come up with some pretty reasonable guesses. But what we really have to do is figure out from a operational point of view of, you know, actually making the building work, how to control that building so it gets the best and most efficient performance. So we need to start designing and changing our buildings in that way. So existing buildings, for certain, we need to understand exactly how they're working. Often we don't. Look at the controls, look at how we can make that more flexible. If that office space is going to change to, I don't know, childcare or a bar or whatever it might be, how can we do that without ripping out the whole mechanical system and putting a new one in? How can we make our buildings work for us rather than creating a static environment that can't change and be flexible. So I thought it was really interesting, and I think it's a really interesting challenge for designers moving forward, and hopefully we pick it up and run with it.
That's great, thank you. I was going to move on a bit to talk a little bit more about sustainability in sort of environmental performance and energy efficiency. In a timely government announcement, there was the industrial decarbonisation strategy announced last week. So thank you for giving us to the government, for giving us a topical subject. It included talking about funding to reduce emissions from public buildings and talking around Neighbours, the Australian scheme that's now being adopted over here. Tom, Stanhope is one of the organisations that supported the development of Neighbours in the UK. What's the plan? What is it you're hoping that it will achieve here?
Yeah, so as you rightly say, Sarah, Stanhope and others are pioneers of Neighbours in the UK and have what's called pioneer projects, where we're looking to sort of road test the Australian or a version of the Australian standard in the UK. It's been developed by the Better Building Partnership, and you know, it's been very successful in Australia at narrowing the performance gap that I talked about at the start of the session. And you know, broadly speaking, from our perspective, you know, it's good to have sort of industry adopted ways of working and standards which allow us to measure our performance, but also the performance of other buildings against each other, so that we all sort of can work together to in this case, you know, reduce the emissions from the operational buildings. I think, you know, one aspect of this, which, you know, happens sometimes with BREEAM and WELL and other standards, is you need to sort of actually make sure that these don't just become sort of badges and tick boxes, that people actually really sort of get on board and see the positive benefits that they can have. And as I said, you know, over a sustained period of time in Australia, this standard has really, across the public and private sector and across different uses, has materially improved the performance of the buildings relative to how they were designed. I think, you know, with regards to our pioneer projects, they're large developments, either refurbishment or new build, and those will take quite a long time, obviously, to be built, and then for the data in use to be measured. I think the more instant win for this is actually to certify the existing building stock, and that's a real way that we can improve performance relatively quickly. So I think, you know, as a more broad point, you know, which ties into Neighbours, but also specification of buildings, I think, you know, we as developers and designers and owners need to be careful that we're spending the money on the right things, and that we're asking the right questions in terms of how we're quite critical about what aspects of the building will have a positive impact on people, you know, such as air quality, and those aspects that will have a positive impact on reducing the operational carbon. You know, on a slightly wider point again, you know, the risk is that, you know, with the shifting dynamics and how people are using commercial buildings, that we end up sort of spending money and specifying the wrong things. So too much importance is placed on the services and the systems that we're putting into buildings, and not enough is placed on some of the stuff that, you know, John and Yasmin were touching on, which is about the, you know, the customer experience and maybe sort of the software of the building as opposed to the hardware. But, you know, we need to, as an industry, work on both fronts really, to make buildings which are relevant to the customers, but also that are performing better in use over time.
Thanks, Tom. Annie, I'm going to pick up on that because I think Tom said something, I don't want to quote, I don't think I'm quoting directly, but something around, oh, do we risk spending too much on building services? So I can't let that one pass without asking your view on, is it possible to spend too much on building services? And I'll move on to Yasmin after that for her view on the kind of building design angle.
I think it absolutely is too much. You can spend too much on building services. I don't disagree with that. But what I think is really important is we need to start looking at the building as a whole. We should stop designing in silos. It's not that you're spending too much on building services, it's that we're not putting the money in the right place. And so I think with neighbours and the CIBSE TM63 is another thing that's tackling the performance gap and operational energy of buildings. It's actually looking at how the building works as a whole. So the facade in combination with building services, in combination with the well-being of the occupants and those types of things. And I mean, all I can say is that what we really need to look at that we don't at the moment is the control strategies of these buildings, because we can put all this wonderful technology on a building, and if we don't control it, if we don't pay attention to it, it's virtually useless. And so I think put the money where it works, and sometimes that's the building services.
Thanks, Annie. Yasmin, just to pick up on that about the design in silos, and I know you've also got views on neighbours. What's your take on where we should be directing the money from an architectural point of view?
Well, I think, you know, there's never one solution, and every building is different, and every budget is different. But I think as a bottom line, we are designing buildings and they need to be good and of good quality and of sustainability now. So neighbours, which actually has been around for 20 years, you know, we've come to it quite late, a bit into the game. I think anything that gives a competitive edge, that actually makes the tenants aware where potentially their money will also go in bills and what have you not, and then gives them that choice of different buildings, will raise the standards of the buildings and building services. Because if I can get a building that is a higher rating than a lower rating, why would I as a tenant go? So I think anything that pushes us, all of us, whether that's developers or the design team, to design for better standards, which is at the end of the day better for our planet, which is what we all want and why we're all here, is the right way to go.
Thanks. John, I know in Australia, where neighbours, I believe, originated, you know, one of the key drivers there is central and local government actually making big commitments to not occupying or not creating buildings that are not high performing. As our public sector representative this morning, what's your view on that in terms of local and or central government taking a lead in this?
Well, two things. One, I think it's amusing that the name Neighbours comes from Australia, so I just wanted to, I thought that should just be pointed out. And secondly, I'm a bit frightened that I'm actually the local government representative, so that two points just to note before we go further. But I think that Yasmin touched on something interesting, which is at the heart of this, and this is a push and pull issue. So how much of this is pushed upon people and how much are people willing to absorb it? And I think at the moment we're transitioning, so there's lots of, you know, news about, you know, green bonds and investment into real estate that has higher credentials. There's the change of the EPC driving kind of institutional investors to ensure their portfolios have much higher performing energy requirements. So there's like we are very much in transition. I think to answer your question, there's probably quite a varied, therefore, response to what local and national government are doing. And there is obviously competing pressures. There's the competing pressure of the spend of income from council tax, which effectively pays for the rent of any properties that a local authority might rent. So if you pay £1 more for a foot because you've got, let's just call it a higher specification building rather than saying sustainability costs money, but you pay for a more higher specification building, then that's £1 you've got to be able to justify. So there has to be a hard cost benefit, and that's hard because we're in this space of, well, what's the right thing to do necessarily, not necessarily the cost. But there is a cost impact, and this is particularly acute for local authorities, because if you spend that £1 getting a more efficient office plate, that's £1 that potentially goes away from adult services, or £1 that goes away from children's services. That is really, really difficult, and that's why we have politicians to take care of these really tricky issues that we mere mortals can't deal with ourselves. But my view is that we are going to move from, at the moment, where people are choosing to do this, to a regulated space where we have to do this. And at the moment it's not, so it is choice. And, you know, some of the things that are in our control as a local authority, you know, around energy efficiency, for example, is you know, changing all the light bulbs and, you know, easy, obvious stuff, putting PVs on the roof, stuff like that. The next bit is going to be harder to find and involves, you know, it involves a spend, as I say, which comes back to this kind of difficult equation. So I think if everyone's pushed to do it, then we're on a fairer playing field. If we're not all pushed to do it and it's a choice, then it's a little bit more difficult, because there are lots of tough choices to make at the moment, and we're starting to get into the incremental space. So I think central government could legislate to move us, to push us into this space quicker.
That's great, thanks. So slightly related, but I wanted to actually, just before we move on from this topic, to talk a little bit about retention and demolition. You know, there's a lot of still quite a lot of demolition and replacement of existing buildings, as opposed to refurbishment. Tom, I think you're doing some quite big refurbishment schemes at the moment. I mean, we're seeing some quite high profile. I mean, Broadgate always springs to mind, because I think I remember Liverpool Street before Broadgate was actually even it started to be built, or certainly in the early days, and now we're looking at the next generation, and I don't feel that old. I mean, can we, given everything we've talked about in terms of sustainability, can we carry on doing this? Can we keep demolishing and rebuilding buildings, or do we just actually need to work harder to make sort of modern workplaces from existing buildings? And will this move to a hybrid, flexible working? I mean, might that be the refurbishment friend? I mean, Tom, what's your view on that?
Yeah, so at Stanhope we are obviously doing quite a lot of extensive refurbishment projects. You know, we're still doing a lot of new build projects as well, and you know there are going to be, you know, still economic, townscape, you know, use factors which will affect, you know, the development decisions that we all take. So carbon is a really key part of that, and it will, you know, continue to be you know, a discussion around how do you responsibly develop. And to responsibly develop may be to you know, work with the existing building and to extend, or it may be to look at, you know, responsible materials, methods of ways of building new. You know, there's a split between embodied carbon, i.e. carbon, you know, that's part of the building of the buildings, and then the operational carbon. And when it comes to looking at existing building stock, you know, there's a massive amount of opportunity to reuse existing building stock. And the key really is that it's, you know, it's got good bones, it's flexible, you know, has good proportions, good quality of light, good floor ceiling heights, you know, is built from a robust structure. And then, you know, if you've got those basic principles, there's quite a lot you can do to improve thermal performance and energy performance, and also to change, you know, the look and feel and make a product that is appropriate for the market. So I don't think there's sort of a one size fits all really on that point. But the key point to make is that just because it's an existing building doesn't mean that it's going to be more sustainable. You know, often existing buildings, if you look at over the lifespan of a building over a 50 to 60 year period, you know, the operational inefficiencies of some existing buildings will really sort of weigh them down in a whole life carbon sense over new. But if we can, as a first principle, always, you know, ask the question, can we retain first, and then move on from that? I think that's a good position to be in, really.
That's great, thanks. Annie, you look like you were wanting to come in on that from your point of view.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think we focus a lot on net zero, which is great, but with the existing building stock, I think that maybe net zero doesn't have to be the goal. So although you know, you've got big refurbishments and maybe you're demolishing, actually, you know, 80% of the building stock is here to stay, and we need to look at that in order to really look at our carbon adjustments and getting down to the levels we want to. And I don't think, if we can't achieve net zero on existing buildings, that shouldn't be a failure. If we can achieve a 50% reduction, that should be seen as a massive win, because we often sort of set ourselves up for targets that are virtually impossible to get, but a larger building stock with a reduction of 30 to 50% in their carbon, that's going to do a lot more than one new building, which is net zero. So I just, yeah, if we look at it as a wider issue as well, not just a single building, we can make a lot of inroads into that issue.
Thanks very much. I'm going to move on. I'm conscious of time. We do want to try and finish on time or thereabouts, and we have got some questions coming in. So just really briefly, obviously the title today was Smart Working and Smart Building. So I just wanted to touch, before we go on to questions, around technology. Tom, just back to you. Are buildings getting smarter? Is that what occupiers want, the smart technology, and perhaps even more importantly, are investors and the funders of these buildings willing to pay for that extra smart tech?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, buildings are never going to be the smartest aspect of, you know, technological projects or society. You know, buildings are containers of people, and people will always be smarter than technology, at least for the long term, particularly when it comes to, you know, creative functions and other aspects, which, as we've talked about on this session, you know, the reason for the office is for human interaction, for creative thinking, and that's not going to get replaced by AI anytime soon. Other functions such as administrative work, you know, are much easier to displace. And you know, technology should always be seen as an enabler of, you know, what are the values, what are the objectives that we as humans are looking to realise to better our quality of life, and how can technology kind of support that. You know, when you look specifically at buildings, you know, buildings can't keep up with technology. You know, it takes, even with the best will in the world, we're actually going backwards on this as well. You know, it takes longer now to design and build a building than it did a few decades ago for various reasons. So you know, the rate of technological change is always going to be quicker than building fabric. And link back to the previous point about which buildings, you know, sustain in the long term, is those buildings that have good bones, that are flexible, that have good proportions. And yet, you know, there can be a layer of technology that comes over the top of that, but us as building professionals, we should focus on, you know, where we're building, how we're building it, you know, and what we're building will have a bigger effect on the quality of life of people and the spaces than the technology. That's not to say we shouldn't be thinking about technology, because clearly we should be, and we are, and the market is demanding that. But it should be secondary, you know, to getting those other things right. But when it comes to technology, what the tenants and occupiers want, it's really that ability to measure and to use data in a sensible way. You know, you can have as much data as you want, but it's only as good as the questions you ask and the metrics that you're looking to take off that. And that relates back to sort of the health and well-being point around, you know, air quality, occupation of space, and if we can use technology to inform some of those key metrics, that will be of real value. But when you look forward to, you know, everyone's talking about 5G at the moment, but we really should be talking about 6G, and you know, when you look further forward, you know, technology rate of change is going to move very quickly, and we want to make sure, back to the point about, you know, how much do we spend on building services, that what we put in should not obviously become obsolete or actually become a negative on the experience of the spaces that people have. You know, a very simple example of that is a USB plug socket. You know, that if you put USB plug sockets in all of your developments, then the USB-C came out, and you've actually created something that is then a negative. It's actually an annoyance to people rather than even being a neutral or a positive. So we just have to be mindful of that buildings can only go so far in delivering what people want from technology and experience, really.
Thank you, Tom. John, I was going to ask you on a sort of slightly different note, because you know, Tom's talking about, you know, technology in individual buildings, whereas up at Meridian Water, you're creating an entire neighbourhood. Where are you in terms of tech and that sort of smart? We've heard a lot about smart neighbourhoods. It seems to be one of the phrases of the day. What's the situation up at Meridian Water, and what's your aspiration?
Yeah, I think I hear what Tom's saying, and the buildings can only go so far. So I think it's a given now that there's an expectation of a certain amount of infrastructure in the development, and in its simplest form, that's just ensuring that we have, you know, potentially fibre optic, high performing broadband spine through the site, so that each building can have the best possible current and future connection. And then we just dot on all the things that we want to then add to that. I think that capturing data from buildings, I think we're still in this phase of knowing what we want to do with capturing data from buildings. So, for example, in some of the early phases, we're making sure we put in monitoring, which feels old-fashioned, but I think we still need to know how those buildings are performing to refine the design as we go through the next 20 years of build. So data capture and analysis is still, I think, an important part to this. And then there's other things which I think other people will group under smart, which is kind of electric vehicles and things like that. And I think we are just starting the journey, and there's probably more work, and there's probably a big opportunity for us at Meridian Water to kind of install something. I don't want to call it more infrastructure, because again, Tom's point, if you put the wrong type of grid in the floor for charging vehicles, and then the vehicles in 10 years time something else, you're going to have to take up a hell of a lot of road. So these are big decisions, but we do need to take steps forward. So I think there's more work to do for us, particularly around kind of transport. But fundamentally, high speed broadband connection, and then plug and play all the devices and all the different things that you want on top of that. And it can be anything from knowing a parcel's arrived, to someone ringing your phone when they press your door buzzer. All this stuff exists now, and I'd expect us to have that kind of stuff on board anyway. I mean, just one final point, some of the interesting stuff's actually happening during the design phase in terms of digital, which is about the use of the 3D model that we've got for the development, which does all the kinds of things you'd expect, in terms of spinning it around and looking at it, but can tell any one of a number of hundreds of people that are working on the project, not just designers, but possibly agents or construction, phasing, programmers, whoever it happens to be. They can spin the model, go in and out of any particular building, of any particular kind of part of the development, and see what it's made of, how big it is, what colour it is, etc. So we are now starting to get to that point where those kind of models are powerful, and it'll be interesting to see. We know what we should be doing with it during operation. I've yet to see that materialise properly in operation.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, John. Right, I'm conscious of the time. We have got some questions coming in, so I'm going to move to some questions. The first one, it's always nice when you get a question from somebody in the audience So John Wright of Stride Triglawn, I'm going to ask this to you, Yasmin, as one architect to another. John's question is around increased levels of fresh air and user control have come to the fore during COVID. And his question is, how can designers respond to this without over providing and increasing energy consumption? And he did pose a couple of possible, is it technology, is it education of building users? How are we going to work with that?
Oh God, I mean, it's, how long is a piece of string? I mean, what we've started doing is actually taking a bit of a learning from what we do in hospitals, what we do in education as well, where we can actually open windows, revolutionary as it might seem. And I think it's definitely part of what we need to look at now. And also we talk about in London now that we're going to have less cars, hopefully in the future, due to various restrictions and whatever have you not. So I think the ability for fresh air is definitely something that should be one of our key focuses. It's a healthier way of being as well. We've done various projects now, already completed with 100% fresh air intake. And, it is a healthier way. So it's definitely something that we need to take further and make it part of what we provide within buildings as a standard, really.
Thanks, Yasmin. We've got a question from Steve H, hasn't said where he's from. I think this one's for you, Annie. Steve feels that businesses don't use their existing systems to their full potential, mainly due to lack of competent BMS users and data collection. What's your view on this, and how can we reduce investment before ploughing money into new and upgraded systems? What can we do to make the most of the existing systems?
Well, this is my favourite question, because this is something that I feel really passionate about. I think you're absolutely right. The trouble is we tend to hand over buildings without a proper manual, especially when it comes to controls. And so I think it's really important to understand where your building sits and how it works. And going sort of back to that smart technology as well, is that what you can do is produce a digital twin, which is sort of like an energy twin of the building. And from that, you can understand how the controls, how everything's working in the building, and upgrade the building according to the model. So there's a CIBSE TM63 gives a kind of guidance to do this, but essentially you calibrate your energy model to your building and you do your control strategies and you look to see what's happening. And the first thing we should all be doing is fixing our buildings before we go anywhere near upgrading the systems, upgrading the controls, and understanding that the more data you get out of a building, the more analysis needs to be done on it. So I know big data is a big thing, but it goes back to that point again. What are we doing with this data? Are we just collecting it for nothing, or are we using it? And I think that's where you have to be really careful, is once you've done the initial analysis, you say, where do we want the control points and where do we want the monitoring? And don't monitor everything for the sake of monitoring everything. Think about, okay, well, that is a problem area, so we need to look at it and we need to monitor it. And so I think it's being clever with data, being clever with controls. And then when you have fixed the building and it's working as it should be working, then's the time to upgrade, then's the time to look at how to make it better. But we have a lot of buildings that don't work properly, and let's fix them first.
That's great, thanks very much. Tom, a question from Barry Shambrook. He wants to know, is there a risk that designers end up spending more time providing information for BREEAM, WELL and other certification rather than designing?
No, I don't think there is. I think what I would say on efficiency of design process related to BREEAM and other things is that it's much easier if you are very clear with your brief and your requirements at the outset of the project, and that then allows the designers to scope and program accordingly. Speaking on designers' behalf, I think the inefficiencies are when things get dropped into the process sort of midway through. But if everyone's clear at the outset, I don't think that should be a problem. Clearly, those sorts of standards, typically, there's a sort of scale of project at which those types of standards come in, and in theory, the design team should be appropriately selected to deliver a scale of project, and those functions either delivered in-house or with sort of a third-party sub-consultant or specialist consultant, should work fine.
So we're not worried collectively that with the introduction of neighbours as another potential standard for building performance, that it's just going to be another layer of things that can, as I think Annie or Tom said earlier, become more of a tick box exercise. Annie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think just my main thought is that the standards and those types of things are great for moving these type of things forward, but we just try not to lose sight of what they're there for. If they're there for sustainable design, then make the decisions for sustainable design, not necessarily for BREEAM. If they're there for neighbours, make the decision on operational energy, not necessarily for neighbours, because they're just there to help. But obviously, if you treat them as a tick box exercise, that's what they'll be. So remember the other benefits of doing these things, not just that you get a certificate at the end. You actually come out with a better building for everyone.
That's great, thanks. And I think we've got time for one more, which is from Alex Shan at CIM Building Analytics. Who do you think is better positioned to bridge the gap between building design and performance? How can design engineers start getting involved in the operation of the buildings post handover? John, I wonder, do you have a view on that, with your client hat on, you're commissioning and designing buildings? Are you getting people involved?
Hi, so you cut off at the end of
Sorry,
that.
I was just saying, are you going to be getting engineers involved to monitor performance post occupancy?
Yeah, I think Annie's picked up on this already, and I would echo it. And I think we've probably got some kind of FM people on the seminar. I think there's the one thing the industry could do, if it could bridge the gap between the design and the construction and the operation, that would be a big step forward. And I think I have sadly seen it many times where the team that goes to the design and construction is quite disconnected from the operational team. I don't know the answer. I think technology can play a part. I think if you've got an interface which is friendly and usable, then you're more likely to kind of be able to understand what it is you need to do to operate the building efficiently. But we've all seen systems, you know, that dirty, imagine that dirty filing cabinet in the corner, and you've opened it and there's broken shelves in it, and at the bottom there's some manuals that say, you know, CDM 19, you know, operation maintenance manual 1990, and you know it's all in bits and covered in dust, and you just, you know, you lose, your heart sinks. And I think we need to move away from that and use technology as an enabler and have a really great interface. But I think we design it each time on each project from scratch, so probably a huge opportunity to improve in this space, I think, as an industry.
Tom, anything to add?
No, just conscious of time. The only thing I'd say is that you know, our industry is a series of broken supply chains. You know, whereas a lot of the efficiencies can be gained when things are aggregated together and you have a flow of information. So I think in that it's being realistic about where we are now across the different disciplines, and in terms of what the working practices are, and then looking at incremental ways that we can improve the measuring and the reporting, and feeding that back into design. Clearly, if you're an asset owner who operates the buildings, you have a much more vested interest and ability to control that than a different type of client structure that's more of a broken supply chain. So it's a tricky challenge, but one that, you know, things like neighbours, you know, will help to improve, really.
That's great, thank you. And thank you very much. Apologies to anyone who posed a question that we didn't get time for. I'm afraid we have run out of time. We've managed just to overshoot by 2 minutes, which is reasonably good going, because it's a subject that I think everybody on the panel could talk about for quite a lot longer. So thanks to everyone who attended, and thanks very much to Tom and John and Yasmin and Annie for sharing their expertise with us. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.